My name is Jean Garrison, and on behalf of the Global and Area Studies Program, the International Programs Office, the Office of the President, and the UW Foundation, I'm pleased to welcome you to our afternoon event with author Lynne Cheney and the Honorable Dick Cheney. Our program, as you know, this afternoon is focusing on James Madison, A Life Reconsidered, which is Lynne Cheney's most recent book. For those of you who know about James Madison, then you know that he was one whose service has left a lasting legacy here in the United States. I'm very pleased to say that our two guests this afternoon have done the same for the University of Wyoming. As we welcome home Dr. Lynne Cheney and Vice President Dick Cheney back to UW, we have an opportunity to thank them for their lasting legacy here on the campus. This includes the funding and the real vision for the Cheney International Center, which is if you are a student who has studied abroad, or if you have a child who is looking to go overseas once they come to the University of Wyoming, then you recognize that the Cheney International Center has become the hub of globalization and internationalization on this campus. And we are continuing to take more students out to the world because of the Cheney gift. Let me say a little bit about the impact that the Cheneys have had on this campus. With the Cheney gift and the state match, which came with it, the Cheney International Center has greatly expanded international study abroad opportunities for students. This is in the area of service learning, study abroad, and also internships. If you look at the record of what this gift has done, then you will see that since the Cheney Endowment was established, over 1,200 students have taken advantage of this and been able to go overseas. Today, as a matter of fact, within the last academic year, about 430 students took advantage of the Cheney grants. And we also on campus here have really enhanced our welcoming of international students on the campus. We have over 800 international students on campus, and I would just like to acknowledge two people who are really key to this. One is President McGinnity, who is right here in front. I'd like to thank him for his vision and what he's done for internationalization here at the University of Wyoming. And also, I'd like to just note that the current president of ASUW, Ahmed Balagon, is actually an international student. So when you walk around the halls, whether it's here in the Legacy Hall at the Gateway Center or over by the Cheney International Center on the main campus, you really see that the University of Wyoming is a part of the world. Today we can boast that the Cheneys have brought support of over $1.3 million in support for study abroad scholarships, and their leadership gift really enhanced a lot of giving and opportunities across the colleges as well. Let me give you a couple of examples of what this has done. Many of our students take advantage of faculty-led programs. And to give you an idea of the variety, if you were a student here at the university, you would have an opportunity to go on one of 32 faculty-led courses around the world. You could go with Professor, if you had the Chinese language background, you could go with Professor Yan Zhang to the Summer Intensive Chinese program in Harbin, or you could go with Professor Peter Parolin in the English department and others in the English department for Shakespeare in England and Italy. You might join Jim Hearn from the anthropology department for the Archaeological Field School in Croatia. If you were a little bit more intrepid, you might join Professor Kimberly Sheldon and Michael Dillon from Zoology and Physiology, exploring tropical biodiversity and conservation through field-based inquiry in Ecuador. And we have a couple of programs going to Nepal. One is the International Internship in Early Child Education out of the College of Education with Professor Nikki Baldwin, or perhaps you would go on the Environmental Quality in the Himalayas course with Professor Peter Stahl from the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. If you were inclined to be involved in service learning, you might join the Shoulder to Shoulder Honduras Brigade, which has been going on since 2007, which takes students down to Honduras. They've built a clinic built by our Engineers Without Borders club, and you would be helping a community which before UW established this relationship, there was no local medical care available to people. Or you might join in water projects with Engineers Without Borders in Guatemala or Kenya. So it goes without saying that these opportunities are made possible by the generosity of people such as the Cheneys. These are but a few small number of examples of what they've done and what they've contributed to, and it's with their partnership with faculty and students here at the University of Wyoming that Wyoming really has gone global. As a matter of fact, I'd like to note that with the vision of the deans in the colleges and President McGinnity and Ann Alexander, who is the director of the International Programs Office, we're looking at establishing an international experience for every UW student by 2020. So that's the vision looking forward. The legacy of the Cheneys keeps moving forward with their endowment, and that will make this a very achievable goal. We also, this afternoon, I think all of us in this hall have a shared interest in the political history of the United States. And that is what brings us here this afternoon. When you look at the book, James Madison, A Life Reconsidered, released in 2014, we see what Publishers Weekly describes as a meticulously researched, richly detailed look at the life and times of Madison, an intellectual power behind the Constitution, its ratification, and the Bill of Rights. Let me turn to the introduction of our author and the Vice President. As you should know, author Lynne Cheney is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She's been studying the nation's fourth president since 1987, when she was a member of the Commission on the Bicentennial of the Constitution. She spent the past 5 years immersed in archival materials and uncovering new aspects of Madison's story. So I'm a political scientist by training. I've read the Federalist Papers about 25 years ago, and I learned a lot from this book. I highly recommend it to you. It is for sale out in the hall. But maybe more important to those of us here in Wyoming is that Lynne Cheney grew up in Casper. She holds a PhD with a specialization in 19th century British literature from the University of Wisconsin. She's the author or co-author of 12 books, including 6 bestsellers about American history for children and their families. And she received an honorary doctoral degree in 1993 from the University of Wyoming. I'm happy to say that she also taught freshman comp here on campus, had an office in Hoyt Hall. So for those of us who are at Hoyt Hall, we have a connection to Mrs. Cheney. Happy to say I have a connection, equally important connection to the Vice President, and that is with a couple of decades in between, I'm also a graduate of the Political Science Department here at the university. The Honorable Dick Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States, served as the Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush. Again, most important to us here in this room, he also served as our Congressman from 1979 to 1989. As I noted, he's a graduate of UW with a BA and MA in political science. And with that, I think you can see that we have a couple of extremely important Wyomingites who have joined us this afternoon to talk about the political history of the United States. Please help me welcome author Lynne Cheney and the Honorable Dick Cheney.
Thank you. Well, we're delighted to be here today, and we've had the opportunity to spend some time this morning. Ben Blaylock's been a great guide, and showing me and Lynn the tremendous advances and work that's been done here on campus over the last several years. You know, I get back here periodically with Lynn. Today we had the opportunity, thanks to Ann, to go over and spend some time at the Institute, and we're very pleased and proud of what you were doing with that resource. It really is remarkable. We also couldn't help but reminisce. The parking lot out here is where we used to live. 486 North Sewell, apartment 275. Fully furnished, it cost $54 a month in 1964. But, I'm often asked how Lynn and I met, and I explain that I was born and spent my early years in Lincoln, Nebraska, and my dad worked for the Soil Conservation Service. And in 1954, he had to choose between two opportunities. One was Great Falls, Montana, and the other was Casper, Wyoming, and he picked Casper, fortunately. And I was in the 8th grade. That's when I met Lynn. She didn't recognize me until we were juniors. First time she'd go out with me. But I explained to a group the other night that if Dad had picked Great Falls, Montana instead of Casper, Wyoming, I would have never met Lynn, and she would have married somebody else. And she said, right, and then he would have been Vice President of the United States. So, anyway, we're delighted to be here, and our basic purpose, obviously, Lynn has done a tremendous job on James Madison. And, even the New York Times gave it a great review, made the New York Times bestseller list, and that's what we're here to talk about today. I am officially here as arm candy, is the way it's described. She didn't do too bad. Anyway, why don't we begin by you telling us what got you involved in this enterprise? Why a book about James Madison?
Well, thank you, and you're not bad, arm candy. Let me just say that. I do want to thank Alan Alexander, too, who runs this program, and Ben Blaylock for having showed us around. I look down this front row here. I also see my friend Celeste Colgan. Can you believe that Celeste Colgan and I taught freshman composition here in 1964? Thanks to us, Wyoming is full of good writers. And our friend Bill Thompson, we've known Bill and Tony for so many years, and we've been privileged. We were privileged to spend that time all those years ago here at the university. Dick is right, our house is torn down, but there is an apartment off an alley that still exists where you lived with Joe Meyer, former Attorney General of the State and Secretary of State. And Ben, as you take us out of town, would you please drive me by? I will. Dick and Joe didn't believe in trash cans. So the one time I was there, I noticed that they sort of used under the table for that purpose. Oh, and the Browns are here. How nice to see you. I'm sure there are so many people here that we would love to visit with. I got started on James Madison so long ago. Sometimes people ask this question by saying, why would anybody spend 5 years on one project, like writing a book? And it's because he is such an interesting character. I was on the Bicentennial Commission of the Constitution, the commission to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Constitution in 1987. And let me tell you, it was quite a group, wide-ranging, from Phyllis Schlafly on one hand to Ted Kennedy on the other. And we were all under the chairmanship of Chief Justice Warren Burger. He had retired then, and this was sort of his first post-retirement job. He was wonderfully inspiring at helping us all to better appreciate the Constitution. And I then became wonderfully inspired by the man who, more than any other, gave us that Constitution, and that's James Madison. He was not a hail fellow well met. He wasn't the kind of politician that, you know, ran up and punched you on the arm or put his arm around your neck. He was very reserved, but very effective. And I think over the years, it took me a long time to get started on the project after I was first inspired by James Madison. I think it was partly, Dick, watching you in politics. You know, I began to understand better how politics works, and I began to understand better that Madison was not only a deep thinker, a profound thinker, someone deeply learned about government, he was also a first-class politician. You don't get the Constitution through the Constitutional Convention without being very clever at bringing people around to see your point of view. But it wasn't just that. He didn't just, you know, he wasn't just the father of the Constitution. He was more responsible than anyone else for the Bill of Rights. And getting that through the Congress, can you imagine? But one of my favorite stories to show what a great politician he was is that, or you know, how people appreciated his political cleverness, is that George Washington relied on him, at least in the beginning. When Washington had an inaugural address to write, and any of you who've ever given a speech and had anybody else help you will recognize what happened. The speechwriter that George Washington first chose produced an 83-page monstrosity. And Washington didn't know where to begin, how to cut this thing down, how to make it interesting. So he asked Madison to please stop by Mount Vernon. And Madison did, and he wrote George Washington's first inaugural address. That in itself was quite an achievement. But then Madison was also, at this point, the leader of the House of Representatives. So after Washington delivered the inaugural, Madison, as leader of the House, responded to it. Okay, now you see, here's Madison's voice, and then Washington, to complete the circle, asked Madison if he would please respond to the House's response. And so he did. I like to say that in the early days of the Republic, Madison's voice was bouncing off every wall. And he got to be where he was, and he would go much further by not only being book smart, but by being very street savvy. So I don't think I answered your question, but it wasn't bad.
Not bad. Talk about his relationship with the other founders. I mean, you obviously picked Madison because of his prominent role as a founder, but would you put him at the top of the list? How did he get along with the others, like obviously Washington and Hamilton and so forth?
Well, you know, it's hard, I think, when you're making a list of the founders and you want to rank them. I just think Washington has to go up at the top. Just such a remarkable human being. And Madison, in the beginning, got along very well with him. But as often happens in politics and in life, they fell out. And they did not get along well with each other. Not long after the government got started, actually, there was a fellow named Alexander Hamilton. He was a New Yorker. He had ideas about big government that Madison found appalling. Hamilton wanted to read the Constitution that Madison had done so much to create. Hamilton wanted to read the Constitution to give the central government all the power. The central government should just have a great reach over the states. And Madison knew himself that that's not what the Constitution meant, starting, of course, a great argument that we're having to this day. The Constitution meant to give the central government enough power, but not an overwhelming amount. And unfortunately, it was Hamilton, we're talking from Madison's point of view, it was Hamilton whom the president listened to. I mean, does this sound like an old story has been told so many times? I think sometimes we don't appreciate the founders as human beings. But here they were quarreling over the direction of the country, just as we continue to do today. Madison was not the one who won this debate. It was Hamilton who won the debate. And then Madison did something that in those days was absolutely unthinkable. He challenged the president, he challenged the government. Now, you got to think back to how it was then. The government had just got started. And so some people viewed any criticism of it as disloyalty, as sedition. You know, what are you going to do? Undermine this government that just got started? That was the way Hamilton was thinking. That's the way President Washington was thinking. He didn't express himself quite so clearly as Hamilton. But Madison thought this can't go unchallenged. And so with Thomas Jefferson, he founded the first opposition party. Now just think, I mean, this all sounds familiar, but it was a very daring act to challenge the president, to challenge the government, and start an opposition party. Washington was so mad at Madison that when he died in the last part of the 18th century, when Washington died, he didn't know he was going to die. You know, he went out and rode his horse and probably got pneumonia. But he wasn't feeling too well. But he had a friend there who was with him, and the friend showed him the newspaper. And the newspaper said that James Monroe had just been elected governor of Virginia, and that James Madison was singing his praise. Well, Washington was just in a rage. He went to bed angry with Madison, and he was dead by the next morning. So what had started out with such great hope, this relationship, ended up tragically, but understandably, in a great rift that endured until Washington's death. So that's one. He and Jefferson were really good friends. There's probably never been a more influential friendship in history than the one between Madison and Jefferson. Jefferson was the kind of guy who had an idea every minute, and you know, they would be high-flown and very inspiring rhetorically. And Madison was the more practical guy. It was like Jefferson was a kite, and every once in a while Madison would pull him back to earth. On the other hand, Jefferson gave us some of the most inspiring prose from the founding period. a scholar whom I like a lot, a man named Merrill Peterson, said, evaluating the friendship, he said, in the end, the account balanced. So it's a story on the one hand of great conflict and on the other hand of great friendship.
Whatever made them think they needed a vice president?
Oh, that's a funny. Dick wants to know, why did they think they needed a vice president? Well, they actually didn't at first. It wasn't obvious that you needed one. It happened as a result of a number of compromises. It was decided that the electors in the states should each have 2 votes. And that was okay with the big states, you know, this big state, little state thing they had going on at the convention. But the little states said, no, we can't do that. The big states will always have the president. You know, they'll cast 2 votes for president from someone from their state, and that leaves us out in the cold. So then somebody said, well, why don't we make the second vote matter? Well, first they passed a law that said you couldn't vote, you couldn't give 2 electoral votes. If you're an elector, you can't give your 2 votes to somebody from the same state. So then the argument comes back, well, people will just throw away that second vote. They'll vote for somebody who could never be president. And so where have we, the little states, gotten ourselves? So then the idea was, make it so you couldn't throw away that second vote, because the person who came in second would be vice president. So that second vote counted. They didn't really think they needed one, you know, until you got down this far. But this explains so many things. It explains why you, luckily for you, were a citizen of Wyoming and not a citizen of Texas when George Bush nominated you to be his vice president. You can't have the president and the vice president from the same state. The situation with Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio is similar today. You know, everybody loves both of them. Some people have said, well, maybe one would be a good vice president. No, they're both from Florida. So one can't be president and the other vice president.
One of the most important things we're thinking about these days, we see it on the news all the time, is the president's responsibility or capacity to function as the commander-in-chief. Mm-hmm. And can you talk about that? One of the interesting things, obviously, about Madison was he was the first president to actually run a war or conduct a war under that provision in the Constitution that says he was the commander, is the commander-in-chief. How did he function? How did he do as commander-in-chief?
Well, go back a minute to the Constitutional Convention. I mean, I know that when you tell students, let's talk about the Constitutional Convention, I'm sure you see eyes glazing over. But it was so interesting. And again, here is Madison making his contribution. The motion before the Constitutional Convention was that the Congress shall have the power to make war. And Madison leapt to his feet and said, let's substitute declare for make. And that made all the difference. Because if the Congress can declare war, it leaves the executive to actually wage war. And you can't, and Madison knew this from his experience during the Revolution, the Congress can't run a war. You know, they're too busy trying to run themselves and figure out their own positions and everything. You need the single executive to be commander-in-chief. Madison's role as commander-in-chief in the War of 1812 is one that scholars still debate today. I come down on the side that he was a good commander-in-chief. The War of 1812. Now, this is the war in which the British burned Washington. Now, you'd think that that wouldn't help your reputation as president, to have the British march up the Patuxent and eventually burn the city of Washington. You wouldn't think that would help. And it didn't. But Madison, by the end of that war, had made it clear that the United States was a free and independent country. One of the points of the war had been the British effort to prove that we were still some sort of satellite of theirs, that we still had to follow them in matters of trade policy, for example. The war made clear that that was not the case. that we were a free and independent nation. Some people, and I include myself, call the War of 1812 the Second War for Independence. And it was that. So people loved that we had achieved that. They also loved Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans, which famously came after the peace treaty was already signed. But that didn't matter. You know, in those days, news traveled so oddly and so slowly that Jackson's victory seemed like the ultimate end of that war, and it was a glorious victory. So all of those things are good. And Madison also proved, I think, the importance of intellectual freedom during that war. He was his whole life, a champion of religious freedom and intellectual freedom. And during that war, New England hated that war. It was interfering with their making money and trade, and that was a big incentive for them to hate that war. And they were even meeting and talking about breaking off from the United States. Madison, though there were many people who encouraged him to go up there to New England and slam people in jail, Madison didn't. He simply let them express their point of view. He did send a few troops up there in case, things got active in terms of trying to secede from the Union. But he was a very tolerant and understanding president, so that makes him great too.
So he was a successful war leader.
I think so, yes. Do you want to argue?
No.
I'm going to ask you some questions here in a minute.
One of the intriguing aspects, I thought, of the book was Dolley Madison's role. Can you talk about what role she played?
Dolley Madison. When you write a book, it's long and it's a little bit grueling, and the research is fun, but I'm telling you, the writing, if you're going to do it well, the writing is taxing. But I can remember, I think Dolley comes in chapter 14. I might have the number wrong. But I kept saying to myself, how long till I get to chapter 14? Because she is so intriguing. First of all, she was beautiful. I mean, Madison fell in love with her when he saw her walking down the street. He said, wow, who's that one? And he had a friend that he knew could introduce him. And that friend, of all people, was Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr introduced James and Dolley Madison. Dolley showed up in a mulberry-colored gown with yellow glass beads, and it was all over for Madison. That was it for him. They married not long after. They were very happily married. He was, as I said, a reserved person. Dolley was full of life and embracing. Bill Thompson, you talked to me about somebody today, this wonderful woman who just took care of everybody. That's what she was like. And while Madison might, if they were having a gathering at their house on F Street, this is before he was president, Madison might, find some friends and go over and talk in the corner. Dolley, no. She didn't care if they were, the parties then were Federalists and the Republican Democrats. Dolley didn't care which one you were part of. Madison was shorthand term a Republican. That's how historians refer to it. But Dolley didn't care if you were Federalist. Come on in, come on in. And she served Southern comfort food. And she knew that she herself was part of the spectacle. She wore, just describing her dresses is fun if you're a writer. I think my favorite outfit was the pink velvet dress that she wore with a lot of gold Moorish jewelry and a white velvet turban topped by peacock feathers. She was part of the entertainment. She was part of the reason you loved to be at the Madison's house. And this was important. Dolley gathered all these members of Congress together. There was nothing else to do in Washington, D.C. There was nothing. Now, there was one club that had entertainment that featured rope dancers. Now, okay, I don't know what they were. I'm wondering, maybe they were tightrope walkers, but I don't know. You could let your imagination go with that. So getting invited to the Madison's house, if you were a member of Congress and you were living in a boarding house, and it was a great thing. And when it came time to be nominated for president, guess who got to choose? The Congressional Caucus. So having all of those people not only admire you, if you're Madison, for your brains and for your political skill, but admire you because it had such a nice time at your house, I think was very useful. So I think she got him elected president. She was an amazing first lady. There are some wonderful portraits in the White House, of course, but one of my favorites is Dolley Madison, partly because there has never been, and nor do I foresee it anytime soon, never before was a portrait made of a woman showing so much flesh. Just look at the picture of Dolley. I mean, it is amazing. She dressed in the French style. Women who didn't think she should would frequently send her handkerchiefs, you know, that she was supposed to drape around her neck, I guess. But she was an amazing first lady. Of course, you all know the part about when the British burned Washington and she got the picture of George Washington cut out of its frame and got it sent off safely. And she loved him, and he loved her, and they had a wonderful, wonderful marriage. The sort of one problem was that Dolley came to the marriage with a stepson, and his name was Paine. And you spelled it P-A-Y-N-E, but P-A-I-N would, you know, be a better description. He was an unmanageable young man who fell into bad habits. He drank and he womanized and he spent money. He even stole things from Montpelier, which was their family home, and he would sell them on the street corner. Now, if you're a historian, this is not such a bad deal because there are still Madison letters floating around out there. We have a friend on the Eastern Shore, Bob Shanahan. He's a realtor. He loves history, but Bob has 2 Madison letters. And if somebody tells you they have a couple of Madison letters, pay attention, because it's possible. The letters were so scattered that they still haven't been gathered together. Paine ran up debts that helped drive Madison into near poverty. By the time he died, and Dolley was the inheritor of the estate, she was poor. There's a ledger book that shows her depending on a 75-cent loan. She was really poor. And everyone loved her. She lived in Washington. She only had one dress, I think, as she became poorer and poorer. It was black, but she still had that white turban. And there's even a picture of her. She lived long enough so that she was photographed. And there's a picture of Dolley in that white turban. She's pretty old, but she still has a great smile.
One of the, I thought, most significant parts of the book, and it was, you know, when you're Republican and you write a book, you don't always expect a great review in the New York Times.
Yes.
But you got a great review from a noted historian who indicated the book as the best single-volume biography we currently have of Madison, which was high praise. But one of the things I thought that was maybe your most significant contribution in terms of the way you dealt with Madison and what you discovered about his life was the situation with his health. And I've always been intrigued that he was able to do so much and have such a huge impact, and yet he obviously had periods of life where he was seriously ill.
You know, no one had really dug into it before. You knew that Madison had had some sort of event when he was trying to be a soldier in the Revolution, and it ended whatever military career he might have had. You knew that once when Dolley was ill, she had a big cyst on her knee, and he drove, well, they went in a carriage, to Philadelphia to deal with the best doctor in the United States, that something happened on the way there. And you knew that when he was a little boy, his grandmother wrote out this list of medicines that she wanted, and these were 19th century medicines, valerian, gentian root, things like that. His grandmother wrote out this list for an epilepsy. And eventually, by going through the papers really thoroughly, talking to an expert in New York City at the Langone Medical Center, a guy who's really, I think, the premier epileptologist in the United States, it became clear that Madison did have a kind of epilepsy. Not the kind that sends you crashing to the ground, but simple partial seizures. The kind of, as Madison described it himself, suspends the intellect. You know, you're there and you can hear, but you can't respond. If you do say anything, it may be a little garbled. It's not the kind of seizure that people generally then or now associate with epilepsy, but pretty clearly that's what it was. He was in the middle of the Virginia ratifying convention, giving a speech, when he suddenly stopped and said, "I have to leave now and I'll be back." And he went off to his room for a day or two and came back. And he later referred to this event as a fit. You know, so there were just so many clues you could put together. And so I think it is easy, with all that information, to say that he did suffer from a form of epilepsy. As you point out, his being able to accomplish all of this was remarkable, all the things that he did. But it was more remarkable because in those days, epilepsy was regarded as demonic possession. You were full of the devil. You were full of sin if you had epilepsy. Madison himself used the word epilepsy at one point. He said that he never published this, that he had episodes somewhat resembling epilepsy. And they were, just not the kind, they were epilepsy, I think, just not the kind people usually thought of. Okay, but if you had it, you were the spawn of the devil. You know, there was this horrible, horrible aura around epilepsy that I think made Madison more a champion of religious freedom than he might have been otherwise, and certainly a champion of intellectual freedom. He said to himself, "This is happening to me," or "This is how I interpret it. This is happening to me, and I'm not sinful. I'm not damned. I'm not, you know, the child of the devil." So there's something wrong when people can make you think something that's not true. And what this country ought to be devoted to is, first of all, religious freedom. You shouldn't be able to tell someone else what to believe, nor should you be told what to believe. But secondly, intellectual freedom. You know, you have the right to decide for yourself what is right or wrong, politically, culturally, as well as in the realm of religion. So, you know, I do think that this is a really important thing to realize about Madison.
What would you say is his greatest accomplishment of all the things he did? What was he proudest of?
Well, it's got to be the Constitution. You know, in a way, I hesitate to say that because that was so early in his career. That was in 1787, and his presidency ended in 1816, and he was accomplishing something every way, every time, every part of that route. He, for example, talked Jefferson into the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson suddenly one day woke up and said, "I'm not sure that's constitutional." And it was Madison who showed him that it was indeed constitutional. So he had this long career, full of achievement, but I do think the Constitution shines brightly as a major achievement, not just for the United States, but for the world. Suddenly you had this country where people could aspire to do and be what they wanted. You had this country where there was liberty for some people, not for all, but where the idea was that, you know, you weren't chained unless you were a slave. You weren't bound to follow the path that your birth might have dictated.
What was his greatest regret?
Well, you know, I was thinking of that. It was slavery. Whenever you write about the founders, the Virginia founders, and, you know, 4 out of the first 5 presidents were from Virginia, you come up against slavery. How could people who advocated freedom keep so many other people unfree and enslaved? All 4 of the founders, Washington, of the founding, the first 5, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, all knew that slavery was wrong. You know, and they said it again and again. I think Jefferson said it most eloquently. When the Missouri Compromise was agreed to, Jefferson called it a fire bell in the night. You know, here was coming the chaos undoing what he had grown up with. But he also said, you know, if God is just, this will happen. So they all knew it was wrong. Madison spent some of his dying days talking to an English feminist named Harriet Martineau, talking about how wrong slavery was. And they all expressed frustration at not knowing how to get out of it. It was one thing if in the earlier part of the 18th century you decided to free your slaves. They could stay where they were. As the century advanced, laws were passed that you couldn't have them stay where they were. They had to go someplace like Illinois. One man who did free his slaves, he only had maybe a dozen, which, you know, Madison had 100. Washington had hundreds. But this one fellow who Madison knew well took his slaves to Illinois. By the time Madison was thinking along these lines, Illinois would not allow them to come in. And so Madison and the other three of the Virginia founders all joined together in something called the American Colonization Society. The idea being it was that you could set up a home for free slaves in Liberia, in Africa. Well, I mean, it wasn't a good solution, and he admitted it to Harriet Martineau. If you are a slave and you have lived at Montpelier for 3 or 4 generations, that's your home. You don't want to go start a new home across the ocean someplace else. So Madison regarded the inability to figure out what to do about this evil institution as his greatest failure.
Where would you rank him? We've got...
He's right under Washington.
Right under Washington.
Now, Dick, that's a good question. Where would you rank the presidents you know?
Well...
No, come on, tell me.
Yeah, well, that's unfair. No, there've been 5 Republican presidents since Eisenhower, and I worked for 4 of them. And I worked closely with the 5th, Ronald Reagan, as part of the House leadership for 8 years. And when I look back and think about them, and as a political scientist, as I was trained here at the University of Wyoming, you look for commonalities across administrations, common themes. When you work for presidents, as I did, you're struck not by the similarities, but by the differences, and how enormously different each personality is, each set of conditions are that they come to office in. If I look specifically at those 5 that I knew personally, I was a chart flipper in the Nixon administration. I was the guy who'd go into the cabinet meeting and flip charts. I was just learning the business working for Don Rumsfeld. Jerry Ford is close to the top of my list because of the circumstances under which he became president. With the impeachment, threatened impeachment of Nixon. And he'd been the first vice president appointed in office under the 25th Amendment. And he always told me he hated his 8 months as vice president. And after I got elected vice president, he used to tell me, Dick, I don't know why you took that damn job. It's the worst job I ever had. And then he'd laugh. And he took great pleasure in it. He saw us through, I think, the worst constitutional crisis since the Civil War. We never before had or have since a situation where a president literally faced impeachment in the House and probably conviction in the Senate. And he got us through an extraordinarily difficult situation, and we sort of made it up on the fly. He hadn't sought the office. He hadn't wanted to be president. He wanted to go home and retire to Grand Rapids. But so he's that was a much more of a personal relationship than some of the others. I loved the job I had under George H.W. Bush, 41, when he made me Secretary of Defense. And if I look at a favorite job from my perspective out of the jobs I had, it would be being Secretary of Defense. The end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Desert Storm, the chance to work with the men and women of the U.S. military. It was just, that'd have to be the highlight. Ronald Reagan, I thought, was a very good president. He had a great personality in terms of leadership. I always remember the first meeting he had with the bipartisan leadership of the Congress. I'd just been elected chairman of the policy committee in the House. And he came up to the House side, and we had a big circle of chairs there. Tip O'Neill was speaker. And the president came in, we all rose. He came over and sat down in the vacant chair. And then Tip he pulled out a piece of paper and he started reading questions off of it about tax policy and education and the economy. And he got all through. He turned to the president, expecting him to answer the questions. He didn't answer the question. He told a joke about some Irish movie actor. We all thought, you can't do that. You got to answer the question. No, you didn't have to answer the question.
What a lesson.
What a lesson. But he was, he had a tremendous capacity for leadership. I always recall when we killed a tax bill he wanted us to pass. And the House Republicans basically rose in revolt, and we voted against this tax bill that he wanted to get over to the Senate and get it through. And so he asked to come up and speak to the House Republicans. And this was about the same time there was a terrible accident. A plane load of troopers in the 101st Airborne crashed up in Canada, coming back from the Sinai. And the memorial service for the troops was down at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, that morning. He went down, of course, as commander-in-chief. And then he came back, and they gathered all of we House Republicans in one of the big hearing rooms there in Rayburn. And President Reagan came in, and he talked about patriotism and sacrifice and what it meant to be an American. And he got through. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. And then he said, now, gentlemen, he said, about that tax bill. That's all he had to say. People started jumping up. Henry Hyde was the first, jumped up and said, I'm with you, Mr. President. You can count on me. Henry just led the charge the week before to kill the bill. And without ever mentioning anything in the bill or the arguments for or against, said, now, gentlemen, about that tax bill. And they turned around 70 votes, took the bill back to the floor, and passed it that afternoon. That was Ronald Reagan's capacity for leadership. 43, George W. First time he asked me to be vice president, I said, no thanks, I don't want the job. Jerry Ford had implanted in my head this notion it was a lousy job. In the end, I was persuaded to do it. He asked me to help him find somebody after. I said no. But I don't think he ever took no for an answer. What he did was put me in a position where I'd have to sit down and talk with him about what he was looking for in a vice president, what kind of qualities he wanted and so forth. And so we got all through with the search, and I knew I was in trouble when he looked at me and said, you know, you're the solution to my problem. And I'll always be grateful for that. He said it would be a significant, consequential vice presidency, that he wanted me because I had the background and experience I did, but he wanted me to be a meaningful part of the administration. I was free to get involved in anything I wanted, but he especially wanted me in the national security, military, foreign policy area. And he was a man of his word. He kept me busy for 8 years. If I was active and involved and doing a lot or being judged as a consequential vice president, that's because that's what he wanted. That's the kind of vice president he wanted. And so that was a remarkable period of time, just because of the things, you know, we were involved with. We started out with a domestic agenda, and then 9/11 came along, this worst attack ever on the United States, 3,000 people killed, Pentagon blown up, World Trade Center and so forth, and that dominated our term in office for the next 7.5 years. So I have great respect and admiration for all of them. It is the world's toughest job. They earn their pay in that big house they live in. And it's remarkable that we have been as successful as we have usually in our selection of presidents.
So whose turn?
I didn't answer the question.
Well, maybe Jean Ann. Jean, do you have some questions?
Yeah.
There's an opportunity for people to submit questions in advance, and I've got 2 or 3 for you. What would Madison have to say about the contemporary Christian right movement and its effort to influence public policy today?
Well, he was such an advocate of religious freedom. You know, he was born an Anglican, Episcopalian, and nobody in Virginia much liked the Baptists. They were, you know, Anglicans are very quiet and reserved, or at least they were then. And the Baptists were out there, you know, shouting about the need for salvation. And it was just not regarded as what you should do, but Madison was their champion. I mean, the Baptists were so looked down upon that when a preacher would gather a group together, you know, men would come through and with whips and disperse the crowd. But Madison was their champion. He just championed the idea that each of us should have the right to believe what we think is correct, and that each of us should have the freedom to say what we think is correct. And I don't think he would be at all dismayed if each of us thought that we had the right to tell our government what we thought they should do.
You spoke a little bit about this, but I wondered if you'd say a little bit more about the process as a scholar and writer to conduct the research and to write a text like this. And you've written a dozen books. So I'm also curious, just to add to this question, what was it like writing this book versus some of the others you've done? And then maybe talk a little bit about what your next project is. Well, first of all, Celeste, my friend, with whom I shared that responsibility of teaching composition for years. Now, Celeste, I don't know if you will agree with me on this, but for years, not just here at the University of Wyoming, but at the University of Wisconsin, at a community college in Virginia, I told freshmen, this is how you write a paper. You get a bunch of note cards. Don't get very big ones because you only put one idea on a note card. And you do lots of research and get that one idea on a note card. And then you sit down and you arrange the note cards. And then you look at the note cards and you write the book. Well, it's not true. I mean, I kind of feel so bad about that I told all these people. You know, it's there's a lot of serendipity involved. I love the research. I just love reading and answering puzzles. What was wrong with Madison? Why did he have his life interrupted so many times? Answering puzzles like that, or you know, what was going on there in the Louisiana Purchase, and you know, following it down trails and rat holes sometimes, and dead ends sometimes. And I do keep notes, but I often use a notebook and just keep them sequentially. Sometimes I put them on a piece of paper and lose it. But it's not an orderly process. You know, I think I convinced all these dear freshmen that it was very orderly. For me, it really isn't. It's kind of messy. My office is usually a little bit messy. But I have to say, one of the wonderful things, if you want to research anything now, is the internet. You know, the collected works of James Madison are on the internet, beautifully edited, of Washington, of Jefferson, of Hamilton. It's all there. And the most obscure 18th century journals, it's just amazing how much you can find without ever you know, leaving your study. So I rely on the internet a lot. And then I am an obsessive rewriter. You know, you write it once, and then you rewrite it, and then you rewrite it. I found out the most interesting thing about Jefferson. He loved poetry. Madison, not so much, but Jefferson loved poetry. I believe that he scanned his prose, you know, to see where the accents were, to see if it worked that way. I do that myself. And, you know, that, I know you're just thinking, how can you do 620 pages if you're busy worrying about scanning your prose? Well, it takes 5 years, that's all. So that's my answer. Oh, how was this book different? It took longer. It's easier to write about yourself. I wrote a book about growing up in Wyoming that only took me a year. It's easier writing about yourself than it is writing about someone else. I have written a number of children's books, and those actually took about a year, because you're working with an illustrator, you know, and you've got that back and forth, push and pull. But I love the children's books too. I'll be honest, I'm the author of this question, but I did submit it through the process in advance. So James Madison, in his writing and through his public service, had a great influence on shaping the U.S. federal government and the polity. What lessons from his life or times seem most pertinent to modern political debates? what do you believe he would say to us today about the nature of American politics and the American political process? And Lynn, I'd give this to you first, but if the Vice President wanted to chime in, we'd welcome that too.
He's had his say. Oh gosh, the question's a long one. Well, first of all, if Madison were to be among us today, he would be appalled at the size and extent of the federal government. No question. I mean, you know, I think Hamilton, who was sort of the champion of big central government, I think he would be appalled. It has gotten so big. It's not to say it's wrong. I'm just telling you what, I mean, I think it's wrong, but I'm just telling you what Madison would think. People are always talking about how destructive politics is. And, you know, I'm sure that you would expect me to say, well, Madison would be appalled at that. No, I think he would totally have expected it. Politics in the early part of the Republic, maybe throughout the Republic, but I certainly know the early Republic, were really mean and nasty. One of my favorite scandals involves Alexander Hamilton. You do with this, I'm just giving you an anecdote, you make of it what you want. Alexander Hamilton was suspected of lining his pockets from his federal service. Perhaps, you know, investing and knowing what was going to come. He was not wealthy, and so people thought he took advantage of his office. In fact, there was evidence that he had paid off this fellow, or that he'd given this fellow money. And the accusation was, you gave Mr. X money to invest it for you, knowing you would make a profit. Well, Hamilton was so appalled at this attack on his honor that he wrote a pamphlet in which he said, I did not give Mr. X money to invest it for me. I gave Mr. X money because I was sleeping with his wife and I wanted him to be quiet about it. So, you know, it never ends. And it got started early.
So in other words, what we see today is what we used to see.
Well, the past, I mean, in a way that's true, and I'm constantly struck by how that's true, but I'm also constantly struck by how the past is different. I don't know how many of you have been to visit one of the presidential homes, but when you go to Montpelier, and you know that's Madison's home, and you've read about it, and you've read about how grand it was, and the lovely red library, and the portraits on the wall, and you go and you realize it's really tiny. They are all really tiny. You know, these great people who led us out from under our dependence on Britain and who created the Republic, in a sense, they were provincials. You know, if you compare Montpelier, say, do you watch Downton Abbey? Compare Montpelier to Highclere Castle. You know, there's no comparison. They were trying with these homes, Montpelier, Mount Vernon, Monticello, they were trying to imitate English country life. And what they did was beautiful, but it was tiny. You know, and so that's part of what makes me understand that we'll never fully understand what was going on. They were acting as provincials on the edge of empire. And oh my, what a thing they accomplished.
Do you think that James Madison would have a solution to some of the political gridlock that we see in Washington today? I mean, you commented on the polarization, or the healthy debate, and how important the healthy debate is for a polity like the United States. But what would you say about some of maybe the polarization and some of the gridlock that comes with that? Would you have something to say to that?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure your assumption's right.
Okay.
Because gridlock's not a bad thing. Think about it. Do you want your government doing things all the time? Or do you want them talking about doing things? I think that the back and forth that maybe doesn't result in as many laws at the end of a Congress, not such a bad thing. And I'm not sure Madison would think it was such a bad thing either.
There's much said about the relationship across the Founding Fathers. And you've spoken a little bit about the relationship between Washington and Madison in particular. I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about Jefferson and Madison. Because I think sometimes we think there's a there's some competition there, and maybe even Monroe, because you talk quite a bit in your book about these four, and you've commented on Alexander Hamilton already, but what about the relationship between Jefferson and Madison?
Well, as I said, they were best friends, but Jefferson wasn't an easy man to be a friend with. He liked to opine from a distance. When Virginia was writing its Constitution, Jefferson was in Philadelphia, and he kept writing them back there in Richmond where they were trying to form a constitution, telling them what to do, and George Mason got really sick of it. He did the same thing to Madison when Jefferson was in France when the Constitution was being written. And he kept opining from across the ocean. He wasn't there. He didn't know what was going on, but that didn't keep him from having very firm opinions. And I think he strained the friendship most. One of the big questions that had to be taken up was, do we have a Bill of Rights now, before the Constitution is ratified, or do we do it later, after the Constitution is ratified? Well, Madison, the politician, knew we do it after. We got our hands full trying to get a Constitution written. Never mind trying to get the Bill of Rights written before we ratify it. So do the Constitution now, get it ratified, and then we'll do the Bill of Rights over here. Well, Jefferson over in Paris, who didn't have the slightest idea of the political difficulties going on, kept saying, no, 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 we got to do it now. And at one point, and I think this may have been the biggest strain on their relationship, Jefferson began writing letters from Paris to other people at the Constitutional Convention, encouraging them to go against what Madison wanted. So that was really not such a friendly thing to do. At one point, Madison said, Mr. Jefferson always likes to take the spoon by the round end. You know, he doesn't like roughness. He likes the things nice and smooth. So he understood whom he was dealing with. I will tell you what to do from a long distance, and that way we won't have to quarrel.
I'll admit that your comment has brought a question to mind. What about the pace of politics and the distances and the fact that the Revolutionary War had been concluded and we have the Battle of New Orleans?
Oh, that was the War of 1812, but that's okay.
War of 1812, well, boy, obviously I'm not a historian. But when you look, you've been an observer and a participant in political life, and the pace is very different today. And
that's a really good point. I mean, I think one of the troubles we have understanding how different the past was is understanding, you know, news couldn't travel any faster than a horse. You know, that's, if you just think about that. And now we have instantaneous news, instantaneous responses to ourselves on the internet. That does make it maybe more grueling. Though, I don't know, riding a horse from Montpelier to Philadelphia was no easy deal either.
Yeah. I'm going to shift to a question that a student asked you at lunch, perhaps both of you. And that was, what advice would you give a student here at the University of Wyoming, given your past in your own college days, your careers? What kind of advice would you want to give to students at the University of Wyoming today?
Well, I think this is reflected, I'll let Dick answer too, but I think this is in part reflected in the program we've chosen to support. Go see the world. Come back and live in Wyoming, but go see the world. You know, maybe not all of it, but go see things that are different and interesting, and then bring that experience back to this wonderful, wonderful place.
Mr. Vice President?
So I'd reflect back, say I was a political scientist and did everything but my dissertation for the PhD because I got caught up in the political wars. But I often felt, as I went through my career, that I wished I had more history. I was glad I was a political scientist, but what I found most helpful, oftentimes vital in terms of understanding a problem or finding a solution to a problem, was to have a thorough and complete understanding of history, especially American history. But I guess if I were to give a student advice, it would be make sure you take the time to learn everything you can about our history as a nation. I worry in part that I really think now in the grades in the public schools around the country, we don't teach history anymore, not the way it ought to be taught.
Well, that's a perfect note to say that we have something for you. We really want to thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
And in light of history, we have a gift for you from all of us in the Cheney International Center. And it's actually a history of the University of Wyoming by Rick Hewitt and Tamsin Hurt here at the American Heritage Institute. And it does have a picture of the Cheney International Center in it, so we have from the start all the way up to the present day. And I think that from this conversation today, I think we probably, I was duly corrected.
I'm sorry. That's the old teacher in me.
Well, that's okay. I correct people, so if you're a teacher, then you welcome being corrected.
Dick, do I ever correct you?
No.
I want to say a couple of thank yous, and that is to Mary Ivanoff here at the Foundation. I really want to thank Manuela Hoffer-McIntyre with Global and Area Studies, everybody else who's involved in the International Programs Office, Ann Alexander, Candace Garman. I'm not going to name everybody, but the Cheney International Center, the University of Wyoming, all of us in this room are really so pleased that you came back, and we look forward to having you come back again. Maybe on the next book, because you didn't answer my question, but I believe you're writing a comparison of some of the early presidents. So maybe when that volume is done, we can invite you back to the Gateway Center.
Or Dick, you might write another book.
It's always possible.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.